IB Nation, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. It is Monday. It is February 24th. We're getting closer and closer to spring ball. That's Shaun Davis. I'm Brian Driscoll. As we get started, folks, do us a favor. Hit that like button for us. If you're listening via podcast, whatever you're listening to, Apple or Spotify, however you listen to the show, we'd greatly appreciate a 5-star review. It helps us out a ton. We would really, really appreciate that. If you're someone who's a regular listener but has never done that, we would greatly appreciate that you do that. Certainly helps us here at Irish Breakdown so we can continue to bring you more content like this, which is sort of an off-season ritual for us, Shaun, as over the last couple of years, which is talking about, has Notre Dame closed the gap? Or in the past, where are they in regard to closing the gap on the elite programs and not just the elite programs, but on winning a championship? And so it's certainly an interesting conversation to have after Notre Dame made a run to the national championship game. So this week's RTCF show is going to kind of go in a little bit different order. We're going to do recruiting at the end. We're going to team first, then we'll talk college football, and then we'll do recruiting, and it all ties together. And it's really about where is Notre Dame at in regard to closing the gap to bringing home another championship. Shaun, I had a buddy of mine I talked to the other day, and I think he went to every playoff game, and I'm not sure if he went to the championship game or not, but I know he went to the first three. And man, he's still having a tough time kind of recovering from that loss. He's someone that's our age, so it's been a long time, and wondering, like, was this the last shot at it? And so we're going to kind of talk about that. When you look at this 24 season, did Notre Dame just kind of have that magical season like 2012? Like, let's think back to some other years where Notre Dame was kind of close and they were just not quite good enough? Or is this truly the beginning of Notre Dame turning that corner and closing the gap? So the first part of today's show will be a breakdown of the different parts of the team and where they have closed the gap and where they haven't, because they didn't win a title, Shaun, so they clearly haven't completely closed the gap. And kind of the two different ways that closing the gap can mean. Part two is we're going to talk about, well, who are they closing the gap on? Is it just a championship? Are there still teams that they have to kind of overcome to get there? We'll talk about that. And then part three, Shaun, the one position where I think that we would all agree the gap still needs to be closed from a recruiting standpoint is D-line. So we'll talk about D-line recruiting, where things are, where things have been the last couple of years. Has Notre Dame taken steps towards closing the gap or not? Have they at one position or not the other, meaning edge versus tackle? And then, of course, looking at the 2026 board and asking ourselves, are there any gap closers on the board? Next week, we will talk about the offensive position, where I think we would all agree the gap needs to be closed the most. That's wide receiver. So that'll be our recruiting topic for next week. We'll talk about the wide receiver board and where things stand, Shaun. But today's show, my friend, we're going to talk about, we wear the shirts, the closing the gap shirts. We talk about it all the time. It's Notre Dame getting back to their not rightful place atop college football, but kind of what I would say the place that we have always felt Notre Dame is. Can they get back to the top of the college football world, not just from the standpoint of being one of the top teams, but being a championship team, not a championship caliber team, but a team that is a championship football team? That's going to be the topic of conversation. And how close is Notre Dame to finally closing the gap where you and I can sit here and put on our gap closed shirts? That's the question that's now in front of us as we get ready to transition into this 2025 season.
It's a very interesting conversation that we're going to have. Shout out to IB Nation. Missed you guys last week. Glad to be back on with you. But we talk about closing the gap. It can become very nuanced. Closing the gap takes several steps. And the higher you go, the more difficult it becomes. I think when you take the previous regime before Marcus Freeman, when they came in, Notre Dame had really taken significant steps back in the football program. So getting back into the conversation of competitiveness is probably an easier step to take, right? Then the next step is, can we become one of the top 10 programs in the nation, a consistent top 10 ranked football program? That's another step. And those steps are easier to fix from a recruiting standpoint. Now, when you start talking about the nuance of it, Can we become that upper echelon, tier 1 group of programs where every year the expectation is national championship and we have the talent to go out there and do it? Now it's about other small things, right? What's the locker room like? What's the leadership like? Injuries, how they're going to impact the depth that we do have. And so this is the next step that Marcus Freeman and his team and his coaching staff face right now, where the expectation is. I looked at this. We took a poll on Lucky Lefty before the season started, and we said, what are your expectations for the third year with Marcus Freeman? And we said 11 to 12 wins, a college football playoff berth, a CFP semifinal berth, national championship game, and winning the national championship. And I think it was like 46% of the people said semifinal. And so Notre Dame exceeded that expectation. And so now you only expect that the expectations of the fan base now would be to return to the national championship game. And we're hoping that Notre Dame can exceed that and win the national championship. But we could get more in depth with it. But it is so difficult to go from this is a difficult step. It's like you feel like it's really close, but it's one of the most difficult steps to go from being able to get there and being able to win it. Like the team that we just lost to in the national championship game, just look at what they've been going through over the last 4 or 5 years just to be able to get over that hump, because they've been right there from a talent standpoint from other areas. So it's going to be an interesting conversation that we're going to have today, because I think either you're going to feel extremely optimistic, because it's all about POV, right? Point of view. You know, some of us will come away from this feeling extremely optimistic. Some will feel somewhat optimistic, and some might feel like I need to see it first. And everyone's well within their rights. But I think when it comes to closing the gap, the one thing we can say from a talent and roster standpoint, that has significantly been changed by Marcus and his staff. And now we start to go into the nuances of continuing to close the gap.
Shaun, when we've talked about this, when we've had this conversation in the past, when we talk about recruiting, we always say there's different types of gap closers, right? There's guys that make you better than you were, which is a version of closing the gap. It doesn't mean you're recruiting as well as, you know, the teams we've always talked about, the Ohio States, the Bamas, the Georgias, the Clemson. It doesn't mean you're recruiting as well as them or you're on their level, but you're better than where you were. Then there's other types of closing a gap, which is, hey, you're already, you know, you're taking big steps, right? I mean, you've taken a giant step by landing Jeremiah Love, Jadarian Price, Keedron Young, and Aeneas Williams in a 3-year stretch. Recruiting wise at running back, like boom, that's closing the gap. And then of course we got there on the product on the field shows us that no gap's closed at running back. I mean, it's their running back room can compete with anybody in the country. So those two different types of closing the gap, and I feel like this is what the 2024 season was. It was I would argue that the 24 season is the biggest move that Notre Dame has made towards this conversation of, is the gap closed, that they've done really since 1993, in my opinion. And the reason that I say that is there's really a lot of different aspects to it. And you mentioned one of them. When you watch this team play, this is the debate that, you know, who I'm going to talk about, but with the former Notre Dame player that I got into debate with, who was trying to tell us, like, no, the talent's not there, the athleticism isn't there, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, bro, we're watching the two different teams. You know, and it's like, then you watch Notre Dame go play Georgia. You watch them go play Penn State. You watch them play Ohio State, and you realize there's still some areas where the gap's not closed yet, but there's definitely a lot of areas where they've either closed the gap, or now other teams like Georgia and Penn State and Texas and all these other teams that people view as the elite programs are now chasing them in certain areas. That's the difference. And then on top of that, that's a theoretical argument. That's my evaluation of this player is such and such, so I believe that they've closed the gap because of my opinion of this player. Then there's the practical. Well, in order to close the gap on Georgia, you got to somehow figure out a way to beat Georgia. Well, there you have it. You say, well, this was a down Georgia team. All right, cool. I'll accept that. This team isn't as good as what the 21 or 22 teams were. Cool. Notre Dame beat you without their starting left tackle. You could say, okay, that was a camp injury. Fine. They beat you without their All-American defensive tackle. Their other All-American defensive tackle was maybe 50% health. They beat you without their starting center. They beat you without their All-American cornerback. They beat you without their starting Viper. They beat you with their replacement for the starting Viper. Like, let's not act like this was a dream season for Notre Dame where everything went perfectly either. And that's the difference. You go and watch them play Penn State. I said this to somebody the other day. I was like, they beat Georgia and didn't even play that well on offense. I mean, it played actually kind of bad on offense. They beat Penn State and didn't play that well on defense. And so when I look at this football team, you say in a lot of ways, like, they accomplished the goal of closing the gap, not completely closed, because here's the one difference. Notre Dame beat Georgia this year. Georgia still has 2 rings in the last 4 years. The gap's not completely closed. You showed that you can go toe-to-toe with Georgia, beat them sometimes, but is that a consistent thing? Or is that just sort of a one-off thing? That's the thing we'll have to find out. You talked about consistent top 10 seasons. We don't know that this team is that. They did it this year. They weren't top 10 the previous 2 years under Marcus Freeman. They haven't been top 10 really since 2021 prior to this year. So can they start stringing those together? Or is it going to be this? I think I know where it's going to be. We think it's going to be staying up here, but it's that part of the provenness of it. You got to show that you can make a title run and get back to that level. Because you mentioned that poll you guys did, and what was my expectation for the season, Shaun? I said minimum expectation is playoff +1, and then depending on who you get, it should be a semifinal berth. Meaning, if you got to the playoff as the 5 seed, and your opponent was like Oklahoma State, Kansas State in the second round, because we're looking to the buys of who the 4 seed would be, then you should be a semifinal team. Well, if before the season I'd have said, okay, Shaun, they're going to get to the quarterfinals and have to play Georgia and Louisiana. Is that a successful season? I don't know that many would have asked, well, what's the outcome? They'd have been like, yep, successful season. And just kind of assumed that's probably not going to go well. I don't know if this team is there yet. Well, that's exactly what happened, and Notre Dame won by 13. And so now, to your point, the expectation is completely changed. Now it's like if I told you expectation next year is going to be playoff +1, people would be like, well, that's disappointing because now the standard is, okay, you should be getting back to the playoffs most years, if not every year. And that's what this season has done, to where it's not, okay, 8-5, 8-5, 12-0, 9-4. It's okay, you went 9-4, then 10-3, then 14-2. Now the expectation is stay in that level. And so that's part of closing the gap, Shaun. You and I did a show. I think our first RTCF show of this offseason was the discussion of, is Notre Dame an elite program and are they tier 1? Because they're 2 different things. Well, this closing the gap conversation is somewhat similar to that, in that I believe that what Notre Dame has done, at least for this season, was put themselves on that elite level. They've recruited at an elite level. I think their returning roster puts them at an elite level, meaning they're a top 5 to 6 team. If you're in the top 5 or 6, you're elite. If you're a semifinal team, you're elite. But tier 1 is reserved for teams that have won titles. They're not there yet. And some won titles along with consistency, because we don't put LSU in the elite category. We don't put, in the tier 1 category. They won a title in 2019. We didn't put Michigan in the tier 1 category. That was the discussion we had. Why? Because there needs to be a level of consistency. A good 2 to 3 year run doesn't make that for you. And so that's the thing that Notre Dame has to prove, is to be tier 1, you have to win a title, and then you've got to be that consistently good team. We did have Ohio State in tier 1 even before the playoff, because even though they hadn't won a title since 2014, because they were just consistently excellent. And that's that next step for Notre Dame on top of winning a title, because otherwise, what is your standard for Notre Dame? Just to be LSU of 19, to be a Michigan of 23, where you win that one title, and then it's like Florida State 2013, and then you have like a nice 2 year run, and then you're back to me. just being solid for the rest of the time? Or is the standard to say, hey, look, you get to that level and then you stay there? And that's what Notre Dame is working to achieve. And that's kind of where this conversation comes from, Shaun, because if you're not consistently there, it becomes much harder to win the big one. It can be done. Michigan showed that last year. LSU showed that in 2019. But it's kind of like everything had to go right for those two teams in those two seasons. It just, it all kind of came together perfectly. And then, of course, after that, the entire roster gets turned over and both teams take huge steps back. And ultimately, that's not where we're trying to get to. And so that's the standard that Notre Dame is chasing, Shaun, is can they get to that point, as you mentioned, where it's not just have that one magical season, but that magical season is, hey, we've kicked down the door, and now the goal is to say, hey, we're going to stay on that level. Because if you keep going back and forth, it makes it so much harder to win a championship, because in a 6-year span, you may have only been a true title contender twice. That means it has to go perfect that season. Where, like with Ohio State, it's like they just kept knocking on the door. Eventually, things were going to go right for them. They were going to get hot at the right time. And it happened. They got in the playoff in 14, won it all, and then they got back in 16. They got back in 19, they got back in 20, they got back in 21, or 22, they got back in 24, and then eventually that it kind of works out for you. But when you're going like, okay, Notre Dame did it in 20 and they didn't get back again until 24, it makes it a whole lot harder to get there when you're a semifinal team once every 5 or 6 years. And so that's the thing that Notre Dame is chasing, to become that closing that gap to where the standpoint from where we are, looking at it from a Notre Dame standpoint, from where you are as a Notre Dame team, to where a championship is. If you're always here and the title is always here, and just every now and then you're just kind of jumping up at it, it's kind of like, think about that dude. When we were in high school, when we first started, kind of maybe even middle school, we first start kind of thinking about like, hey man, I wonder if I could touch the rim. And so you take those jumps at it, and you're not quite getting there. Like, are you there where you have to jump up to try to get to that level? Or are you just kind of like, okay, I'm 6'10" now, and and I can just kind of nonchalantly dunk it because I'm so much closer to where that is. That's what Ohio State did. And that's even what Michigan did, with that 3 years in a row. They just chant, playoff. Eventually everything goes right and you make that run. And that's, that's really where Notre Dame has got to get to. And we're going to find out if this 2024 season was the beginning of that, or does this mirror other past years? But as I said, when I look at this team, I think this team was different than those past teams, Shaun, where just like it all came together. And you want a great example of that? Look at the NFL draft. How many Notre Dame players are people talking about getting drafted? It's not a big list, 6 to 8. Maybe nobody in round 1, maybe a guy or two in round 2. Well, why? Is that because Notre Dame just really wasn't that good? No, it's because a lot of their best players are coming back. A lot of their best players had no choice but to come back. They are going to have to play college football somewhere next year. Didn't maybe have to be Notre Dame. And I think that's what makes this different, is when you think about all the 2012 team lost. I mean, you knew the next year they weren't making another run. You lost Manti and Zach Martin. Actually, no, you brought back Zach Martin in 2013. You lost Manti. You lost Tyler Eifert. You lost, a lot of really good. Cap was gone after that team. You had some guys coming back. Tuitt came back. Zach Martin came back. Nix came back. But you lost a lot of players from that previous year's team. And they just weren't. You knew that it just kind of all went together. They won a bunch of 13-6, 17-14 games. This team wasn't doing a whole lot of that. This team was blowing people out. And 14 wins, 12 of them by double digits. Those are things you look at. So that's what makes me think that this season is different, Shaun. But Notre Dame now has to go out and prove that it is something that they can kind of replicate on a year-to-year basis.
The interesting part when you talk about that is now, as you start to talk about those seasons, I think something that allowed Notre Dame to make this jump was continuity, and also an ever-improving staff, coaches, and administration. That is something that is being has become somewhat of a challenge or an obstacle this offseason, that are questions that need to be answered within this program. So is the program now strong enough to go ahead and to sustain those losses, make the right decisions, and to continue to ascend, or does it level off a little bit until things are kind of, the turbulence kind of subsides? That's going to be interesting to watch as well. I do believe that Marcus Freeman now has really developed as a head coach on the field. I think he's even developed as a leader. He's always been charismatic, always been a great leader in recruiting to get you in the door or to get you in the conversation. But now I think he's even spreading his wings and developing in other areas as far as leading an administration and be able to be that conduit between the school administration and make sure that everything is working or getting to a peak level for the program. So I'm encouraged that as we move on, the right decisions will be made in order to fill certain voids as we move forward that will cause them to become that consistent top 10 program. Of course, that's me projecting. But I do think, when you were talking about that 2012 team, we need to take a look at some similarities to another team that had somewhat of a dream season. Of course, they didn't have a playoff. If they had an expanded playoff, that team probably has a chance to make a run. Talking about the 2015-16 team. That team with the talent they had, maybe if they get in on the back end of those playoffs, maybe they win a game or two. They might not make it to the national championship game because of the injuries. But I just wanted to point out, going into that offseason, they had a quarterback battle. They had some other questions of who are going to be the next leaders because you lost a lot of leadership. There are some similar questions that need to be answered. A totally different man at the helm.
You talking about going from 15 to 16 or going into 15?
Yes. Okay. Because going into 16, you had a lot of questions. I remember talking, you had a lot of questions. There are a lot of other people that still had high expectations because you had the quarterback coming back. You had an injured quarterback returning. You had two guys that you felt like were really good in that room that had the capabilities of leading you to a great season. You had youngsters coming in. You had a pretty good recruiting class coming in. But those things that were lacking or the questions that were there in the offseason weren't answered the correct way. I have confidence that the questions of this offseason can be answered. And I'm willing to say that the roster coming back, in my opinion, is better. Just the overall roster coming back is better than what came back from that 15 team going into 16. So just want to point that out. Like, there are questions to be answered, but, I think those questions, Notre Dame's well equipped to answer those questions much better than, say, the 16 team was.
And that's what's so frustrating, though, Shaun, is because this notion that Notre Dame hasn't been able to recruit at an elite level since Lou Holtz was here just has never been true. Notre Dame had an unwillingness sometimes to recruit the way they needed to. But even with all of Brian Kelly's deficiencies as a recruiter, and he had plenty, they were able to put that 2015 team together. But again, what stood in their way? See, here's why I was like, you're like, maybe they could have made a run. Nope, they wouldn't have. Why? Because we saw what happened when they played good teams. Brian Van Gorder got schooled and Brian Kelly got schooled. That's why they lost to 3 top 5 teams. They were competitive in the 2 regular season losses. They weren't overly competitive against Ohio State. It's a little bit of a different situation. They had a lot of injuries, including some that week. Sheldon Day got hurt that week. CJ Prosise was still hurt. There was some weirdness going on with that team. But the point is, there was always something that kept that team from being what they should have been, what they could have been. I think of the 2017 team. If the 2017 team maybe had a little bit better coaching and quarterback development prior to that season, who knows how that season could have gone. There's always been these different excuses of sort of what kept Notre Dame from winning. I remember talking to a Notre Dame coach that was part of the 2017 or 2018 team after they got the whole turnover, and they're like, good Lord, like, we've watched film with 2015, and one coach actually coached against Notre Dame in 2015, and they were like, if we had that roster, we're winning a title this year. And that's what's so frustrating, because there have been some years like that. Now, recently, I don't think that's been the case, because I think that's when the recruiting woes and some of the bad staff decisions really caught up to Notre Dame, was in sort of that 19 to 22 type of range. And you saw some of those things. If they weren't able to get Jack Cohn out of the portal, what does the 2021 season look like? Looks a whole lot different. Different things like that. 2020, I think the COVID year really benefited Notre Dame because their schedule got weakened in a lot of ways. I don't know how good that team would have been if they'd have had to play their original schedule of playing, Wisconsin and having to play. Whether that game was supposed to be in Lambeau in 2020, correct? Having to play Arkansas that year. I mean, there just was a lot of different things. USC that year, a lot of different things you look at and say they caught some breaks to get there, and it helped hide some of the deficiencies that team had from a player standpoint and to a degree from a coaching standpoint. The question that Marcus Freeman now has to answer, and it's like he's taken steps to answer it, but now it's like we got to find out if they were were your hires as good as we hope that they are, and that's gonna be gonna determine something for his long term. Of, is Notre Dame going to be able to kind of just stay this way, or are they just going to be what they've always been? Because look at Brian Kelly's seasons, and you look at the 2012, the two best seasons he had, three best seasons he had were 2012, 2015, 2017, and 2018. The only time there was a good back-to-back seasons was 17 and 18. That's it. You think about the 2012 team that went 12-1, went 8-5 the year before, 9-4 the year after. You look at the 2015 team, went 8-5 the year before, lost at home to Louisville, lost at home to Northwestern, lost to Arizona State, got blown out by USC. And then you look at the year after, you went 4-8. Two disasters sandwiched around that incredibly talented 2015 team. 17 and 18, you had good back-to-back years. And then that's kind of when the run of good records started. But as we've talked about, some of those teams like 19 and 21 were really fueled by incredibly soft schedules. You give those teams some of the schedules from early on in Brian Kelly's tenure, and they're not going 11-2. Because why do we say that? Because they never beat anybody good. We've talked about this. In 19 and 21, those two seasons combined, Notre Dame went 22-4. Their record against ranked opponents was 1-3. 1-3. And the one win was over Navy. They got blown out by Michigan, got beat by Georgia, got whooped at home by Cincinnati, and then lost a bowl game to Oklahoma State. So you were 1-4 actually against ranked teams. So that team, you go have to play some of the schedules early on in Kelly's tenure, and they're not 11-2. So they weren't back-to-back good seasons because those teams weren't legitimate title contenders. The 17 team was a couple things away from being a really great team, including a head coach to get you ready to win. 2018 was a heck of a football team. That just happened to be the year where there was two other outstanding football teams in Clemson and Alabama. And I think, and then 19, you could talk to me all you want. Well, 11-2 season. They were very average that season. They just out-talented people. They were not a very good team. They just had more talent. And that's not what I want to see at Notre Dame. I don't want to see Notre Dame go 11-2 this year, 10-2 at regular season, get to a bowl game against an Iowa State, and you go 11-2, and we look back and they're like, yeah, but you played two good teams all year and they both beat you, and your schedule was soft. I don't want to see that anymore because that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about back-to-back good records. We're talking about, can they get to where they're back-to-back teams that you look at and say, that team was one of the best teams in college football. And that's what Marcus Freeman has to prove that he can do. Brian Kelly, I would argue, did that once, 17 and 18. Now he's got to prove that he can do that and really string together a couple outstanding football seasons. Because even like last year, Notre Dame went 10-3 last year, but it wasn't a season where we really felt like, boy, what a great year. They were play here or play there, because it's like whenever they played good teams, they didn't look good. Got completely outplayed by Clemson, got completely outplayed by Louisville. You needed a fourth quarter comeback to beat Duke, and you choked the game away against Ohio State. That's the four good teams you played all year. USC, you stomped. But by that point in time, the pressure was off because you had already had two losses, and your season was basically over from a championship standpoint. So those are the things that Marcus Freeman has to show that he can do, and show that he can kind of get Notre Dame over that hump and continue to make the right hires and keep that hunger. That's going to be the big thing, is can you stay hungry? Because here's what's happened, Shaun. We've pointed this out. I believe all but 1 year of the college football playoff, all but 1 year, I think it was one. Trev and I went back and looked at this. All but 1 year, the next year, somebody took a huge step back to varying degrees. And will Notre Dame be that team this year, or will it be one of Texas, Ohio State, or Penn State? Or is this the year that breaks the mold, breaks the trend of somebody taking a big step back? And so is Notre Dame going to be Cincinnati? Are they going to be TCU? Are they going to be, a team like that where you look at the next year, Michigan State goes to the playoffs in 2015. The next year they're 3-9. Like Florida State goes to the playoff in 2014. The next year they take a step back. I think they went 10-3, but they got a couple. They didn't look great doing it. They were clearly not a contender. We've seen this in a lot of years where a team that's really good gets to that level, takes a big step back. And so Notre Dame's got to be – Notre Dame has to prove that they're not that team. And we're going to, we'll see if they are. They certainly have a lot to prove. And that's what kind of closing the gap is, Shaun, because the teams that consistently win championships, with the exception of those teams that are just kind of those fluky years, are teams that are just constantly knocking on the door. Constantly knocking on the door. We're almost there. We're almost there. We're almost there. Even Georgia was doing that, even though from 17 to 20, they only made the playoff once. But they were constantly knocking on the door. I mean, we're close, we're close, we're close, we're close, we're close. And then boom, kick down the door and you get there. And so that's what this team has to show that they can do. And that ultimately will determine if this season of 24 was a one-off like we've seen in the past, or was this truly, Shaun, I think of that scene from Lord of the Rings. This is the turning of the tide. Is this what that is? Is this the turning of the tide for Notre Dame or not? And that's what makes this 25 season so important.
And you know what? Just to piggyback off of that, something interesting to really think about. Notre Dame has been able, or Notre Dame showed us the inverse of what the normal process is. And what I mean by that, we usually watch teams ascend to the tier 1 level and then have to figure out different ways to win when they're not playing the way that they want to play. Notre Dame was able to get to the national championship game playing a way, particularly on offense, that's not what they want to do when they get to what they expect to be as a consistent national championship contender. And that in itself, one could say that's what made this season so special, that they realized in the midst of a regular season, okay, this is the way we're going to have to do it this year. Collectively, this is the way that, hey, as a coaching staff, this is not what we want. This is probably not what we envisioned, but this is the way we're going to have to get it done this year. For me, that is an inverse of that doesn't usually happen when you're climbing. That usually happens after you've done it, after you've gotten there. And now, because of, changes to the rosters, injuries, and other things, now you have to figure things out. We've seen that in the NFL with the Chiefs. Like, they just had to figure a way. Our offense is not as explosive as it was, but we still have to figure out a way to go out here and win games. Now the challenge for Notre Dame is, or the blessing, I guess, of that is, they feel like, and I'm sure we're about to go into our next topic, they feel like that they have some things that they have yet to unveil as a program, let's say offensively, or let's say even defensively, that they feel like they can get better in certain areas that's really going to make a difference and give them the ability to close those last little incremental gaps that are very difficult to close. And so for me, that is something going into next year that I think the coaching staff feels very confident about. That, okay, we were able to do that, not really doing what we envision ourselves being as a program. So if we can do it having to hunker down and do it that way. Now that we unveil what we know, what we have, or what we feel like we have on both sides of the ball, now we feel really good about the ability to go ahead and stack top 10 national championship contender seasons. And so I think that's where the coaching staff is in the midst of, certain changes that have happened on the coaching staff. I think this coaching staff is really confident and I think they have the mindset, let's finish. Now it's time to finish. We're here. Now let's go ahead and do what we need to do in order to finish the job.
Let me ask you this, Shaun, before we move on to the next part of this breakdown as we look at the closing the gap feature. The next part of this breakdown is we're going to look at offense and defense specifically and talk about areas right now we're talking kind of big pictures of team. We're going to talk about the offense. Have they closed the gap there? Are they closing the gap there? And then as a whole, and then position groups will kind of say, here's where the gap's already closed. Here's where work still needs to be done. But would you say this? What would you say, Shaun, is I have my opinion. I want to give you a chance to say yours first. What is the minimum level of success next season, minimum, that says, okay, they're establishing a level of consistency that even if the season doesn't end with a championship game run again, what's the minimum level of success that tells us, okay, this team is here to stay? And obviously there's the context of it's not that way because of a schedule that made it easier to get there, but because you performed at a level. What's the minimum level that you think this team needs to get to in order for them to say, hey, look, they are turning the corner. They are now arrived at that level of consistency that even if they're not a championship contender, it's further evidence the gap is being closed because they didn't have that big step back that we've seen from so many other Notre Dame teams.
It's going to be measured individually and season-wise for me. I think individually, I still want to see them under Marcus Freeman. They've been far more successful in big games and against good teams, top 25 teams, even top 10 teams under Marcus Freeman. I want to see that trend continue. That would make me feel like, okay, this thing is starting to become more consistent as a program. And then big picture, you definitely want to see Notre Dame make the playoffs. And then once they make the playoffs, you definitely want to see them be able to get to at least a semifinal. For me, my expectations, if you had asked me this a month ago, would have been much higher. Because I do think there is something to be said for the coaches that are no longer there, specifically the defensive coordinator. I do think that is something to really, keep our eyes on, especially when you get into a playoff scenario. So I'll say, no, not semifinal. I'll say playoff, win the first game. And then from there, I think because it is, you're bringing back a talented roster, but you're bringing about a talented roster with questions. We assume Boubacar Traore can get back to what he was. That's an assumption. Right. Jordan Botelho has been through a lot. So I don't know how much we can even assume at this point, right? We assume what we saw from Bryce Young last year. We assume that there's going to be ascension. We have to see it because now he's going to be playing more snaps. The expectations are higher, and people are going to have them on his radar in the scouting report. He's a guy that they're going to identify now on the defensive line. What is Logan Thomas going to get? So, yes, the talent's there, but we have to see it develop, right? You lose two important cogs on the inside. Marcus Freeman raved all year about his interior defensive lineman on the scout team. He talked about him. He loved what he saw, but they haven't played meaningful minutes. We don't know, right? And so you have confidence on the back end because of what returns, but they have to play. Like you feel confident, but they have to play. They have to be put into those moments. They have to be able to respond. So I'm going to be able to say they should make the playoffs at minimum, but then I'll go a step further and say they should be able to win that first round game at minimum. That's just the floor. right now. If you're going to be a consistent program, that is the floor. Now, to talk about the ceiling of what they can do, that's a totally different conversation. But that floor for me is making the playoffs and then winning a game. Because I do feel like you can't, what they have lost from an administration and coaching staff standpoint, you just can't minimize that. You just can't.
Right.
Continuity, figuring things out. Do I have faith in Marcus Freeman? Absolutely. But in certain situations, could it come back? We remember everybody loved Al Golden, but we know what that first Ohio State game in a clutch situation, the calls that he made. We
2 years
fan base.
Tell you what, if you take out Al Golden's 3 games against Ohio State, his career was pretty spectacular.
Yeah.
But 3 years in a row, that's the one thing I'll look back on Al Golden and say, you had the bad call after in 21 or 22 where Tariq goes down and you put Jaden Mickey in a man situation, blitz both safeties, bad call. You have back-to-back plays late in the fourth quarter where, number one, you give up a 3rd and 19, and then you give up back-to-back plays where you only have 10 guys on the field, and then whatever the heck we watched this year.
Yeah.
Like you take out Ohio State, Al Golden dominated people except for that.
Yeah.
And that's obviously a bit of concern, and that's part of that closing the gap thing that we'll talk about here, Shaun. But you and I agree then. I'm glad you said that. I have the same minimum standard than what we had last year, which is with no context of who they play in the second round, it's playoffs +1. Now, just like last year, Shaun, that's the standard with no context. If the context is, okay, you're the 5 seed and you play the 4 seed and the 4 seed is Kansas State, then my expectation is that you're a semifinal team. If you're playing an SMU, you're playing a team in Arizona State, then yes, you should be a semi. But we don't know the context of that. If you're playing Georgia again in the Sugar Bowl and or the Peach Bowl even in Atlanta in the quarterfinals and you lose by a field goal, okay, yeah, the season didn't end the way we want it to, but this still is a team that has put themselves on that level. And then the further I would need to see is how do they play in that game. That's going to be the other thing. If they go back to you get to the quarters and you get smashed by somebody, that's like, okay, that's a bigger step back than I would have liked to feel comfortable with. But I think without context of how the games are played or who you played, the minimum standard is another playoff bid +1. Because to your point, I think this team is – we'll get more into what I think this 25 team can be down the road. So I'm not going to go down that – I'm not going to go there because I was about to get us down a tangent, Shaun. We're about to talk for another hour before we got to the next part of the show. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show some discipline today, Shaun. I'm going to show some discipline. And so I do think – and I think that part of that is when you do lose, you got to look good doing it, kind of like they did. I mean, even the Ohio State game, the game didn't go how I wanted it to go. Even in a loss, it didn't go. I never wanted it to be a situation where I have to, it's not that I have a problem admitting, but where we have to recognize that, like, look, Ohio State did call off the Dogs 31-7. That was a mistake. And that allowed Notre Dame to come roaring back to where they're a 3rd and 11 stop away from getting the ball back with a chance to tie. And if they would have made a short field goal, get the ball back with a chance to win. But they did fall behind 31-7. So that game did not go how it went, but they finished differently than a lot of those other teams, where those other teams just keep getting rolled because they didn't belong on the field with those top teams. This team belonged, they just played poorly. And then when they figured it out, they started doing what we know they can do again. And so that's part of it too, is how do you look in those moments? How do you look as a team? I mean, do you go 11-1 because your schedule's soft and you have a lot of close wins over just okay teams, and then you get a draw of a not very good team in the first round? You get the number 17 ranked team in the country as the 12 or 11, but they just happen to be in there because they were the 5th conference champ or something, and you beat them in an ugly game, and then you get smacked in the quarterfinals. That's not a step in the right direction. So there's always context to it, but just looking good and getting at least to the quarterfinals is the minimum standard for me, as far as saying, hey, they're continuing to turn that corner. then obviously the ceiling is if they get back to the championship game, then we know that they've arrived. Or if they get back to the semis, then it's a no-brainer in that case. But that's the minimum for me. We're going to move on to the offense and defense, Shaun, here next, folks. But before we do us a solid. Hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast. I dropped a big intel piece on the board last night about the latest with D-line recruiting. A lot of intel in there about where the board is, who's on the board, where do they stand, what needs to be done. We'll talk about the board to a degree in the show, but there's a lot of things in there that we won't get to because that's going to be reserved for the intel feature on the premium message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. And then a couple hours ago, I dropped just the entire defensive board, linebacker, corner, safety, who's on the board, who are they recruiting, where do things stand right now here in late February. And then later tonight, I will drop the offensive intel piece of just going through the entire board of here's where things stand. So you're going to want to check those things out. You can only get that stuff at boards.irishbreakdown.com. It's one of the many things that one of the many perks of being a member of the premium message board. So check that out at boards.irishbreakdown.com.